So hopefully we'll see everyone there. I didn't say this, but I should. Perhaps arrive early for the Christmas Eve service, because it will get packed out in here pretty quickly, I think, if it's anything like last year and previous years. And during that Christmas Eve service, I will wrap up the series that we've been doing throughout this Advent season, this time of preparation leading up to Christmas. But today I want to continue that and talk about continue to talk about the meaning of the incarnation. We've called this series God with Us, which is the meaning of the name Emmanuel, which is one we sing a lot about here at Christmas time. And we're just exploring what that means to our lives. What does it mean to us on an everyday basis that God came to earth as this little baby? Because it's nice to celebrate someone's birthday, but if you think about like other birthdays we celebrate, like Victoria Day, doesn't have a lot of effect on my life that I know about. But this birthday, because it wasn't just the birth of Jesus, someone we like, but it was actually God coming to earth in human flesh and human form, actually has a lot to say to our lives on a regular basis, on a daily basis. In this incredible event that we call the incarnation or enfleshment, we believe that God actually became a human being, that Jesus was fully human, just like you and I. He lived the human experience. He had a body like ours. He had a brain like ours. But that somehow, in some mysterious way, at the same time, he was also fully God. And so we celebrate that at Christmas time and all the implications of it. And here's something, I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but Jesus is the only person in the history of the world to have ever picked his own mother. You ever thought about that? You ever wished you could have picked your mother? You know, when you're a kid growing up, the mom who gave the best snacks or who bought their kid video games or whatever. You know, I'm going back to my childhood here. But like, you know, you don't get to pick your parents except for Jesus. So Jesus is unique in that way. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not, but if I was God and I wanted to come to earth, I would show up as an adult. I would skip that whole growing up phase. I would come as an adult. I would be taller than I am. I would be more buff than I am. And I would have a commanding presence and a square jaw, okay? So that's like if I were God and I was picking to sort of show up on earth, that's kind of how I would come. Not as a baby, not as a fragile, vulnerable, tiny little human being completely dependent on his mother. But that's how God chose to come to earth to truly experience our human condition. I want to read the passage that talks about when God announced to this mother, Mary, that she was going to be his mom. He looked across human history. He looked throughout all the different people alive at that time, and he said, you're the one. You're the one who's going to be my mom. And so this is how that all worked out. In Luke chapter 1, verse 26, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, that was Jesus' aunt, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David," or great-great-great-great-great-grandfather David, "and he will reign on over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin." The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, so the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative," I guess she wasn't an aunt, she was like a second cousin or something like that, is going to have a child in her old age. And she who was said to be unable to conceive is now in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail. I am the Lord's servant, Mary answered. May your word to me be fulfilled, or may it be for me as you have said. Then the angel left her. At that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, probably so that she could get there before she started showing, and that would have been a scandal, right? Where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." And Mary said, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but he has lifted up the humble. He fills the hungry with good things, but he has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors." Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months and then returned home. So maybe it wasn't because she was showing. Because she would have been showing when she went home. So that's a beautiful passage that talks about the angel coming to Mary and then Mary's incredible obedient response. That last part there, known as the Magnificat in some circles, because the Latin word for my soul magnifies was Magnificat, and so it became known as that. And it's this incredible expression of worship to God, her response to God choosing her, that she had found favor with God, that the Lord was with her, that God had a plan for her life. Now, that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to zigzag a bit on our journey around this, but we're going to talk today about the fact that God didn't just have a plan for Mary's life, but that God had a plan for the whole world, and he also has a plan for our lives as well. And so today, the practical implication of this idea that Jesus came to earth was that it was part of a larger plan. And that God is a God who plans. And he has plans for you and he has plans for me. So if I lose you in my zigzagging today, because we're going to visit a few different places, that's what I want you to get out of it. Whenever I think about this idea of God having a plan for my life, there's a particular verse that comes to mind that's been meaningful to me throughout my life. It's Jeremiah 29:11. You might be familiar with it. It might mean something to you as well. If not, I'd like to introduce it to you because it's a beautiful passage that I think brings hope when life gets confusing. It says this, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." It's a beautiful passage. It's a meaningful passage for us. But it can also be a dangerous passage if we over-individualize it, if we make it all about us. It's really important to note that when the angel comes and says to Mary, "I have a plan, God has a plan for your life," Mary doesn't go, oh goody, it's all about me. She does say, wow, this is such a privilege. From now on, people are, in all generations, are going to call me blessed because God picked me for this particular task. But then she ties it into a much larger plan. She understands that God's doing something bigger. And so she talks in that song about God bringing down rulers from their thrones, filling the hungry with good things, changing the order so it's upside down, and finally remembering to be merciful to Israel. And so she ties it into this grand narrative that God has been telling for centuries. She understands that, yeah, it's a plan for her life, but it's bigger than her life. And so I think as we think about this idea of God having a plan, it's always important for us to understand that God may have plans for us, but he also is telling a bigger story that we get to be a part of. So Christmas is this turning point in the incredible sort of cosmic narrative that God's been telling for centuries. It's the ultimate plot twist. When things look dark and hopeless and like there is no way out, the author becomes part of the story and becomes the hero of the story. It's important to understand that this was not a spontaneous thing for God. I talked a couple weeks ago about how when you're downstairs messing around and your parent finally decided to come down there, don't make me come down there. When they finally did come down there, it was because they had boiled over, right? That they had become so frustrated that it was time that they had to come down and fix things. That's not why God came. He didn't get more and more frustrated to the point where he just boiled over and stormed down to earth to do it himself. It had been his plan from the very beginning. If you go back to the very beginning of the Bible, you have two human beings, Adam and Eve, living in the Garden of Eden, this perfect paradise, living in harmony with each other, in harmony with God, is this utopian existence. They were perfectly happy. There was no shame, nothing between them or God. But then they sinned. They rebelled against God. The one thing that he told them not to do, they went and did. And they brought judgment on themselves and on their descendants. And they were kind of sent into exile, kicked out of the garden, kicked out of this utopian existence. And it wasn't just a judgment that fell on them, but on their descendants as well. And so we feel that disconnect thousands of years later. Not that we don't have our own stuff that gets between us and God, but we've sort of inherited this position of being in exile from the true amazing existence that God originally had designed for us. But it's interesting that even as God pronounces his judgment and kicks them out of the garden, puts them into exile, he looks at the serpent that had tempted them. In Genesis 3:17, he says this to the serpent or to Satan. He says, he predicts or pronounces this curse on him. He says, I will put enmity or antagonism between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So, if you're a woman here today and you don't like snakes, now you know why. God put enmity. No, I don't know if that's what that means. But theologians look at this passage and say, this is the earliest prediction of what God would do through Christ. It's really interesting the way it's phrased, because it really, how it should read is, I will put enmity between you and the couple, right? The serpent and the couple, not just the woman. Why just the woman? And your offspring, not just Eve's offspring, but Adam and Eve's offspring, and they will crush your head, but you will strike their heel. It should be plural, right? Not just one offspring. But theologians look at this and say, maybe it's intentional that that's a singular passage, that God wasn't talking about all of humanity, but he was looking forward in time, even from that moment when he first fell, and knowing that there would be a particular offspring, not of the man, but only of the woman, who would come against that serpent, against Satan. And they would see the cross as the time when Satan struck at Jesus' heel, but ended up having his head crushed. Does that make sense? I don't know if you're following me here or not, but Theologians think that this was an early prediction, that even from the moment we fell, God already knew what he was going to do through Jesus. God already knew he was going to come to earth and gain us victory. So anyway, that's an interesting little side there. The idea that even back in the very beginning, God looked at the human race and he said, I'm having to kick you out of this garden. I'm having to cut you off in some ways from a relationship with me because you chose that. Your relationships with each other are going to be rough from now on. It was Adam and Eve's first two sons that Cain killed Abel. Things are going to be hard. But don't worry, because I know the plans that I have for the human race. And they're plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to bring you a future and a hope. Now, we talked a few weeks ago about the fact that then God reached in and he called this guy named Abraham, and he said to Abraham, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. I'm going to do something through you to bless everyone, all nations. Then Abraham's descendants end up in Egypt, but God delivers them out through Moses. He kind of brings them halfway, at least, into the promised land, not quite there, but at least into a place where they're not slaves anymore. And before Moses dies, God says to Moses, you know what, someday I'm going to raise up another prophet like you. And again, theologians look at that passage and say, when God said that to Moses, he was talking about when Jesus came as the Messiah, that he was talking about another great leader to lead people out of slavery, which we talked about a few weeks ago, how Jesus led us out of slavery to sin. And so even when God was beginning to bring his people, Israel, into the promised land, he still knew that someday he was going to come to earth. Someday he was going to come down and fix things, that what he was doing through Moses was just a temporary solution. And then, as we talked about, Moses died. Joshua brings them into the promised land. They enjoy peace and prosperity. And as they get established there, he gives them, at their request, a king. Their first king, Saul, didn't work out so well. He kind of strayed away. But then God raised up this shepherd boy named David. And David became the greatest king in Israel's history, this warrior poet, this guy who's described as a man after God's own heart. And at one point, David has settled down in his own palace, in his own home, and he realizes that the Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized God's presence among the Israelites, was still in a tent in the tabernacle they had brought with them in the wilderness when they moved around. And David says, shoot, here I am living in this great palace, and God's living in a tent. And so he goes to God and he says, God, I want to build you a house. I want to build you a temple. And God says, no, you're not the one to do it. And this is how God answers David when David says, hey, I want to build you a temple. 1 Chronicles 17:11-4 says this. Well, first of all, he kind of says, no, you're not to build me a temple. I didn't ask for one. I don't need one. I'm okay in this tent for now. But then he says, when your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take away my love from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. And if you want to read this whole passage, David just responds to God with this incredibly grateful prayer, like, who am I that you would bless me in this way? Who am I that you would choose me and my family? Now, part of that verse, part of that prediction referred to David's son Solomon, who did go on and built a physical temple for God. But Solomon kind of strayed a little bit away from God, and he ended up dying, like most of us. And so the idea that his kingdom would be established forever, maybe, just maybe, there is someone else that was being talked about in this passage beyond Solomon. someone who would set up not just Israel as a kingdom, but who would reign over God's house in God's kingdom forever, like that passage said. And so this idea that well, first of all, David says, hey, God, I have some plans for you. I will build this temple for you because you need a house. And God says, thank you, but no thank you. That's not the plans that I have for you. But I do have plans for you, David, and I have plans for your family too. And part of this is going to be that someday one of your descendants is going to be incredibly special. It's going to set up this incredible eternal kingdom, a kingdom that won't be with an end. You know, you're going to die, you're going to go to be with your ancestors, but this, one of your descendants is going to set up a kingdom that won't end. Excuse me. Now that continues to be a theme through the Old Testament. God keeps predicting through the different prophets in the Old Testament that someday he would raise up a descendant of David. And this descendant of David would establish this incredible time of peace and prosperity, this eternal kingdom that wouldn't end. And so this person came to be known over time as the Messiah, which is the Hebrew word for it, or the Christ, which is the Greek word. So Messiah and Christ are the same word. Or in English, they literally both mean anointed one or chosen one. And so Israel was waiting for this chosen one, this anointed one, this Messiah, Christ, to come and set up an eternal kingdom. And so when the angel shows up to Mary, and he says to Mary, he says, the son that you're going to bear will be great. And he'll be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord, his God, will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever, and his kingdom will never end. She knows exactly what the angel's talking about. I mean, she may not know all the ins and outs of what Jesus is going to do or how he's going to come, but she knows that she gets to be part of this grand story that God's been telling for centuries. She understands that this baby that she's going to give birth to is going to be the descendant of David who sets up the kingdom that never ends. And so she says, yes. She says to the angel at the end, she says, may it be with me as you have said. Or basically, may your word to be fulfilled. I'm okay with this. And I think that's really important when we think about God's plans for our lives. First of all, to understand they involve much more than just us. God has big plans. He also knows the plans he has for us, plans to prosper us, not to harm us, to give us a future and a hope. But he also has the same kind of plans for the whole world. And sometimes we get to be a part of his plans, not just for our little kingdom, our little lives, but for his eternal kingdom, what he's doing on a grand scale. But the plans that he has for us don't generally come automatically. God doesn't force us to do his will like robots. God wants our consent, our submission. And so it's really important here to understand that Mary says, yes, I'll do this. Thank you for the privilege. Because that's a really important part of finding God's plan for our life. I think sometimes we're tempted when we think about God's plans for our life. We just think like, I'd like to know your plan for getting me out of this mess, right? Or I'd like to know your plan for getting me a raise at work and getting me a nicer house and stuff like that. But there's another sense in which if we want to walk in God's plans for our life, we have to go to him and say, whatever it is you want me to do, however I fit into this big plan that you're telling, I trust you. I know it's going to be for my good, even if not always for my comfort. And I say yes to your plan for my life. I think sometimes people think that it just happens automatically, that God just sort of like controls us like little chess pieces, but I don't think that's how it works. And with Mary, I think it's really important to realize that just because she said yes to God's good plan for her life didn't mean that everything went well or came easily. To play this incredibly privileged role cost Mary a lot. I don't know if you've ever thought about what Mary had to give up in order to bear this child. The first thing, she'd have to give up her spotless reputation. It would have been shameful to be pregnant before you were fully married. They were engaged in this sort of unbreakable engagement, but they couldn't sleep together yet. And when your belly starts getting big, generally it means kind of one thing. And so she would have, I'm sure explained to everyone that an angel told her that it was God's child. But would you have believed her? No. It took an angel to convince Joseph, her fiance, the same thing. And so she would have had to give up her reputation. People would have thought stuff about her and about Joseph that would not have been kind. And in that day, it may even have endangered her life, her safety. She also would have had to give up her dream of a wedding, right? How many people at that age in life, she was probably a teenager, and she would have watched all of her friends, getting married, putting on the dress, having the great celebration, and this pregnancy would have stolen away her dream of that wedding day. She wouldn't have been able to have it, or at least it would have certainly colored it. Then she ended up having to take this uncomfortable journey while she's pregnant. Whether she was on a donkey or not, the Bible doesn't really say, but whatever the case is, traveling when you're pregnant, even in a car, is not nice, I've heard. To travel outdoors on a donkey, etc. And then to give birth in a barn? Like, if this is how you treat your friends, God, no wonder you have so few, right? Like, couldn't there have been at least a room in the inn? Like, it's one thing giving birth in a motel room, but in a barn behind the motel is quite a different thing. And like, we have our cute little manger scenes and stuff, and it looks all romantic and everyone's smiling. I bet not everyone was smiling on that real night. When Joseph came back and said, "I'm sorry, Mary, they don't have any room," but they did tell us that we could use the stable. I would have liked to see the stare that she gave him. Anyway. But that was nothing compared to watching her son arrested, whipped, tortured, falsely accused, nailed to a cross, and hung to die. Her firstborn son. Following God's plan for her life cost Mary a lot. Oh yeah, let's not forget too, that when Herod came to kill all the babies, God said, hurry up and go to Egypt. And they had to go back to Egypt. Egypt was not necessarily a great place for Israel to go back to, right? Since their whole communal narrative was that God rescued them out of Egypt. And then they ended up having to go back to Egypt to hide out until Herod stopped killing babies. Like, this is not an easy path for Mary. And God's plans for us are not always easy and smooth. And yet somehow we have to understand that even when things are hard and even things when are dark, God still knows the plans he has for us. And they're plans to prosper us and not to harm us and to give us a future and a hope. And I think when we quote that passage, we would do well to remember the context in which it was written. If you look at Jeremiah 20, that's Jeremiah 29:11. If you were to look at Jeremiah 29, verse 1, you would see that the passage was originally a letter written to the survivors who were in exile in Babylon. Two words are important there. One is survivors. Survivors means that there were a lot of people who didn't survive, right? So they likely watched family members and friends and community leaders die. And so they had this grief to have said goodbye and to have seen so many of their own people violently killed by Nebuchadnezzar as he invaded their land and then dragged them off into exile into Babylon. So they're living outside of the promised land, this land that symbolized God's blessing on them. And they're there in this foreign land where they don't have any possessions, where they're not necessarily slaves, but they're foreigners being forced to stay away from their homeland. And some of their prophets said to them, this could not be God's will. God will rescue us from exile. God will get us out of this predicament, and he'll do it quick. We'll be here max 1 or 2 years, and then we'll be back in the promised land. And a lot of the prophets were saying that. And Jeremiah comes along and he scratches his head and he says, well, that's not what God's telling me. Jeremiah was not always popular because he did not say the things that people wanted to hear. But he was always accurate because God actually spoke through him. And Jeremiah said, actually, you're not going to be gone in 1 or 2 years. You're going to stay in exile for 70 years. 70 years is quite long enough to die, especially in those days. So basically he was saying you're never going to see your homeland again. Your family members that are back there, you're probably never going to see them again. Maybe your kids will see the promised land again when they're old. But it's going to be 70 years. And so Jeremiah says, settle down. Just buy houses, dig in for the long haul. Again, Jeremiah is not the most popular guy at this point, but he's the most accurate guy. And in the midst of telling them that God is not going to give them what they want and that God is going to leave them in exile, he writes this verse, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. Just because God has a plan for us doesn't mean it's always what we want or when we want it. Doesn't mean we can always see the purpose or how it all works together, but we can trust the idea that his plans are to prosper us for our good, not for our harm, and that they're to give us a future and hope. I want to take a little side note, a little opportunity to do a little side note here, and I think there's a couple things that as Christians we should stop saying. And the first is this: God is in control. Sounds nice, doesn't it? God is in control. Some ways he's the ruler of the universe, but I think the whole point of the scriptures is that God gave control over to us and we screwed it up. And so when we say that God is in control, sometimes that's a bit of a scapegoat thing to things that are actually our fault. The truth is that God gave human beings real free will. He left us in charge of the world. And so in many situations, we are in control. When you look at a terrible situation like Aleppo right now, and you see children dying and hundreds of thousands of people kicked out of their homes and their lives torn apart and ruined, and you say, God is in control, I'm pretty sure you're pointing the finger the wrong direction. You know who's in control in Aleppo is human beings, and that's why things are so screwed up. But I think what we can say is that even in that darkness where humans are making some huge mistakes and doing some terrible things, God has a plan. So he's not in control like moving us around like pawns, but he does have a plan. And I can guarantee you that even though he's not in control of the bombings in Aleppo, he's present with the people there. He cares about them. And he has plans to prosper them, not to harm them. His plans to somehow give them a future and a hope. And so maybe instead of saying God is in control, we can start saying God has a plan. God has a plan. And sometimes we mess up his plans, but God still then gets another plan. He's pretty good at that. Romans 8:28 says that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. That means that even dark and terrible things, things that are the fault of human beings, things that God would never will, that he's there working to bring good. So the other thing that I think we should stop saying is that everything happens for a reason. Now, in one way it does, right? Everything kind of has a cause and effect. So yes, everything happens for a reason. Why are there bombs being dropped on Aleppo? Because government said that there should be, because pilots fly over and press a button, or however that works. But it's not because God said there should be. And when we say everything happens for a reason, sometimes it sounds like we're putting the blame on God, like everything happens for a divine reason. And again, I don't think God controls the universe that way. I don't think God wills those terrible things to happen. And yet, there's nothing that happens that God can't fit into his plans for us. So maybe instead of saying everything happens for a reason, we could say God has a plan for everything that happens. God is working. God is working to redeem. And sometimes things are so bad, there's no way that God could bring enough good out of them to make it worth it. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I don't think God says, I'm going to do this terrible thing so that you can learn a lesson. But I do think that there is nothing that is so terrible that God can't bring some good out of it. And that God, no matter how dark, no matter how terrible things are, God knows the plans he has for us. And they are plans to prosper us, to bring us hope, to bring us into a future. So, maybe in your life, tragedies struck. Maybe you're facing a situation that's overwhelming for you and you can't find your way out. You're feeling confused. You're feeling discouraged. This is part of the message of Christmas, that God has a plan. He's not in a hurry with his plan. He comes at just the right time. But he'll do whatever it takes to enact this good plan. For us as human beings, he'll come down to earth. He'll become one of us. He'll give himself as a sacrifice for our sins to rescue us. He'll do whatever it takes to make sure that his plans are the ones that ultimately prevail, even if things go pretty bad, even if things look pretty bleak. When I was reading the first Christmas passage we read, one of the verses really stood out to me. It was when Mary came to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth said all those great high and mighty things like, who am I that you should come to me, the mother of my Lord, and all those things. And then she ends with this sentence. She says, blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her. Blessed is she or he who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her. There's a blessing, a state of happiness, peace, shalom is the Hebrew word for it, that comes when we can trust God. That God's promises to us are true. That he will come through for us. That he will work out his plans and will lead us forward. We're going to close with a couple of songs, and I want it just to be a time for you to sort of think this through. Am I trusting God with the things in my life? Have I said yes to his plans for me, or am I still trying to operate on my own plans? Am I willing to do whatever it takes to see his plans enacted? Think through those things. Pray through those things. Reflect on them. The first is a carol. It's, again, one of those B carols, not quite as popular. But it was written by the American poet Longfellow. And it was written a couple years after the tragic death of his wife. Traumatic event for him. It was written in the midst of the American Civil War. And his son was a young officer, and he had just got news shortly before that he had been gravely injured. He was still alive, but majorly injured. And I think he was almost giving up hope. And he sat down and he wrote this poem, which was later set to music, that expresses this trust in God's plans for the world, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Then the second song we'll do is not a Christmas carol at all, but it's a personal expression of trusting God's plans for our life. So I just invite you as we do these songs to let it be a time of renewing your trust in God.